What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, we're going to go over DOM navigation together in JavaScript. What we're going to see is that there's just so many ways to traverse this document object model. There's things like parents and children and nodes and elements and siblings and all this kind of stuff. It sounds like I'm talking about a family tree, but funnily enough, actually the DOM kind of resembles that. And if we kind of think of it in that context, it might help with some of these examples. So it's going to be a really important topic because we're going to need to figure out how to traverse both down in the DOM and then up through the DOM and kind of across it, kind of in pretty much every framework and even just in vanilla front-end development. So I can't wait to get to some examples here and really kind of tease apart these different nuances between these different terminologies. Let's get right to it. Okay, so to start, I just want to kind of pose this question again, and we saw this in the previous video, right? We looked at querySelector before, but we're going to pose this from kind of a different angle. So imagine that we have like a document, right, that kind of looks like this in HTML. Right? We have our head tag, which has a title in it, and then we have our body tag, which has a couple of elements in it. In this case, an H1 and a div with a P in it, right? So we asked, how can we access this content from JavaScript? Like, for example, the title element, right? Or this paragraph element, the P element right here, right? So we could do things like querySelector the title, or we could querySelector the P tag, or if it had an ID or a class, we could use that to grab that different element. However, there is definitely other ways to actually go about this. And the reason that we need to know this is that there are cases where maybe we can't really easily use querySelector to get to something, or maybe there's just not necessary at all. Maybe we already have something query selected, and we just kind of want to look at the children in there and kind of do different things with it. When we're actually building our own DOM in the future, this is going to become especially apparent and important because we're going to need to basically build out these like little family trees or DOM trees down below the element that we're creating before we can insert it into the actual browser DOM. So let's kind of take a look at some of these concepts, starting with this idea of parents and children. So to start, I want you to picture this HTML element right here. Okay, so this is just a visualization. To refer to the actual HTML kind of element itself, right? So this is without the doc type at the top, which is its own separate node type. So the actual HTML element, the actual main document element itself, we can use document.documentElement. All right. I know that sounds kind of like redundant. Document actually refers to a whole bunch of things, including things like we can grab the node type, or sorry, the doc type and a bunch of stuff in there. But document.documentElement specifically refers to just the HTML node or element itself. So if we think of that as kind of the root of this family tree, and that's the HTML element, well, we can kind of draw a tree that grows downwards from there with this head and the body and all of their respective elements that are children, right? So if we think of this document.document element as the parent, right, we could then actually do document.document element.children. And that's an actual property of an HTML element node, right, which we'll see shortly. And if we do that, we'll actually get a list, right? A node list specifically, which is very similar to an array, which we saw previously, of two elements in this case, right? We have the head, which is a child directly, and then the body, which is a child directly, right? Now, this sounds kind of morbid because we're splitting them up. So maybe the parent-child example of a family tree or actual people and kids is not the best example. However, hopefully this kind of makes sense, right? We have two elements here that are kind of the child of this parent, which is the document element itself. We have the head and we have the body. Now, this is kind of weird, right? If you think about it, because initially you might be looking at this and be like, wait a minute, Nader, like this isn't really true. There's actually more children in here, right? There's a title, and there's an H1, and there's a div, and there's a P tag, right? And that's true. Those are definitely all children. But when we refer to children in the context of a DOM node or DOM element in this case, it's direct children, okay? What are direct descendants of this, in this case, HTML tag, all right? So very similar to, how you might have a kid, for example. That kid is a direct descendant of you, and then you would be, for example, their parent. But if your kid had their own kid, that kid wouldn't call you their parent, right? You'd be the grandparent basically in that case. So you could say that your direct children are kind of in this set of children, but then their children are kind of separate to this idea of your direct children. So when we refer to children in the context of a DOM, right, we're talking about direct children of the parent that we're actually talking about. In this case, that parent is a document element. So we have two direct children. Now, inside of that children, since it's a list, we have the first element, which is head, and we can refer to that as element 0. And we have the second element, which is the body, which is element 1 or index 1. Now, if we kind of take this a little bit further, now we can kind of set any element as the parent, right? So another property of document is document.body. Just like we saw document element is this entire HTML element. There's document.head, which refers to just the head, and then document.body, which refers to just the body node directly. So if we say document.body, we're referring to this green section right here, everything in between the body tags. But if we say document.body.children, we're asking for the direct descendants, the direct children of the body HTML element itself. In this case, there are two, right? There's the h1 tag, and then there's the div tag. Okay, so very similar to how the document element itself had two children, which are the head and the body. The body in this case has two children, which are the h1 and the div. You can imagine if we go further where we grab the div and we ask for its children, that would be an array of size 1, or a node list, I should say, of size 1 with just the p tag inside of it. Okay, so let's actually kind of code this out really quick together before we look at some kind of extra terminology we're going to need to keep in mind when we're actually talking about this idea of a tree. So I'm going to pull up VS Code here, and I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call this navigation dot, I always try to do JS, but I'm going to do HTML in here. I'm going to just put my doc type up here, doc type HTML. I'm going to do my HTML here. I'm going to do a head, and inside of the head, I'm going to do a title, not a time, definitely a title. And I'm just going to say welcome in here. And inside of the body, which I'm going to create next, I'm going to do an h1, and let me just flip back to my slides here. I had hi as a title and welcome in there. So I'll just do hi as a title here, and I'll do welcome in here just to keep it consistent with what I have in my slides. And I remember I have a div in there, and then in the div, I have a paragraph with a meow, and then I have my little emoji in there. So let me grab my little cat emoji. Okay, so I'm going to save that. It's going to shift it over from prettier. And that's our document, right? So if I right click on this and I reveal in Finder, I'll kind of get it in my Finder or your Explorer if you're on Windows. And if I double click on that, it's going to open up in Chrome, right? So we've seen this before. That's all totally wonderful. Now, if I right click and I do inspect, I'm going to get my console over here or my inspector. I can zoom in on that as well, just so it's super clear. We have both the head here and then the body, the h1, the div, and then the p tag inside of it. Okay, so that's all pretty great. Now, if I switch over to my console tab, if I just do document, I can do document and it'll refer to kind of this entire document. Notice that Chrome is actually displaying this as like a nicely viewable, clickable kind of exploration of the HTML. However, technically this is an object, and we can kind of look inside of it to see all the properties. But notice specifically that this doc type is in there. Okay, now contrast this to the document.documentElement. All right, if I do that, notice how, look at the difference between these two. This is just the HTML, and this has the doc type at the top. Okay, so keep this in mind when we go to the next topic, which is talking about like siblings and firstChild and lastChild and all that kind of stuff, because this is going to make a slight difference when we're talking about those things. So the document element is just the actual root of the HTML tree itself, ignoring things like the doc type. Okay, now if I do document.documentElement.children, can't spell, there we go. Notice how I get those two elements, right? It's a little bit cut off here. It's an HTML collection, but I think you can see the main parts here. We have the head, which if I highlight over it, we don't see anything because it's technically invisible, right? It has all of the properties in there, specifically in this case, the title, which is actually up here, right? Which is not visible in the actual document, hence why it's not being highlighted. But then we have the body, which if I highlight, actually highlights it in the actual browser, which is really nice. And inside of here, we have all of our tags. So we can say that the document element, which is this one right here, has two direct children, which are the head and the body, right? So if I just clear this out really quick, and I do document.head, I'll get the head tag, and I do .children. You'll notice that it has one child. It has just the title, right? Which makes sense. And if I document.body.children, I get an H1 as well as the div, right? And those are the only two children inside of the body. Perfect. So hopefully that makes sense. It definitely is important to know that children are the direct descendants, and we can actually dive further into each of the elements to see their own children. All right. Now here is where things get kind of funky. So check this out. So when we're talking about DOM navigation, there are actually many different methods to actually grab stuff out of the DOM beyond just querySelector and the children that I just showed you. Now, if you recall back to the DOM node types video previously that we went through together, we saw that there's actually other types of nodes apart from just HTML nodes. The most common ones were the text node as well as the comment node. All right. So what I'm going to do is, just for fun really quick, I'm actually going to come over to VS Code here, and right above this H1 tag, I'm going to put a comment. I always forget how to do comments here, just like that, right? So bang, and then or angle bracket, bang, dash, dash, and then dash, dash, and then angle bracket. And I'm going to say my cat blog is awesome. It's a work in progress, right? And this will be our little comment in there. I can also have a text node. Okay, so for example, right below this div, I'm just going to put yo, right? Just kind of floating along by itself. All right. And this is not in an HTML element. It's inside the div, but technically it's not wrapped in something like a p tag or an h1 tag that is expecting to have text in it. So this is actually a text node, and this is a comment node. Okay. Now I want you to see something kind of interesting. If I switch back to Chrome really quick before I show you the rest of this, and I do, if I reload the page, I think that's the most important thing, we can see that yo actually shows up in here, right? So I'm going to do document.body.children. And notice that we have an h1 and a div, right? But what we don't have is a comment in there, and we don't also have a, well, technically the text node is inside the div node, right? So if I do this, just to show you, to prove it to you, if I do document.querySelector, just to grab the only div on the page in this case, which is that one, and I do .children, notice how there's only a p tag in there, right? Notice how the yo, which is a text element, is not in there. Okay, this is really important. So why is this, right? So let's take a look at these DOM navigation methods, and I've grouped these together hopefully in a way that makes sense. Let's start in the top left, or in the top row, I guess, with actually the blue elements. So we have something called the firstChild and the firstElementChild. We also have, as you might expect, a lastChild and a lastElementChild. All right. Now, as you might expect, this is going to refer to the first thing in the list of children and then the last thing in the list of children. However, it's kind of confusing because you're kind of thinking probably, why is there two of these? Why not just like firstChild, lastChild, right? Well, let me show you something. So if I come back here and I clear out my console, and again, just so you remember, right? This is our DOM, right? Or this is our HTML, sorry, right? Inside the body, we have our comment, h1, div, text, paragraph, and that's it. Okay. Now, if we come back to console, so if we do document.body.firstChild, we get a text node. Actually, this is not what I expected it to be. I'm going to be completely honest. I actually expected this to be a comment node, right? So recall that if we have a comment here, this is based on a node versus an element, so we expect to see a comment as the first node. So let me just switch back to here really quick, because I think this is actually an important lesson for us to keep in mind. firstChild and lastChild are based on nodes, okay? Regular nodes. That includes comments, text nodes, other types of nodes, but also element nodes. firstElement and lastElementChild are based on HTML elements only. They ignore the other node types like texts and comments. So if I switch back here and I do document.body.firstElementChild, what we'll see is that the firstElementChild is an h1 tag, right? Which is what we expect in the first element. Because if we switch back to our elements here, we can look in the body and we can see that the first node is actually a comment node, but then we have the first element node being the h1 tag. Okay, and we know that a comment node and text nodes are not HTML elements; they're actually their own node type, right? So why are we getting a text node? So if I open this text node up and I scroll down a little bit, we can see that the node value here, right, is kind of a new line and then a bunch of spaces. So this is kind of curious. I think that this actually has to do with the fact that I'm using prettier, right? So when I actually have my code being reformatted here by prettier behind the scenes, what's actually happening, it looks like, is it's kind of prettier is inserting kind of this new line and a bunch of spaces automatically. So if I come back in here and I go to the Elements tab, let's see if that's true. If I right click on my body here, and I edit it as HTML, it's a little bit small, and I press backspace a bunch of times so that these angle brackets line up right beside each other so that there's no spaces in between, and I click out to actually save that. If I switch back to my console and I do document.body.firstChild now, notice that I actually get the actual comment now, right? So it looks like prettier was actually inserting these text nodes for me behind the scenes and actually kind of formatting it that way to actually be an actual node in the DOM. So I'm going to guess that if I do document.body.lastChild, look at that, we have a text node as well over there, and that is a whole bunch of new lines as the node value as well. So that's kind of interesting, right? We can actually peel back what's happening in this case with prettier, where it's actually inserting nodes into our DOM for us without us even really technically knowing. This would actually be relatively invisible unless we were to actually look at this. So where does this bring us, right? If we think of firstChild and firstElementChild, I really want to repeat, right? firstChild and lastChild are dealing with nodes. We can actually get comment nodes and we can get text nodes, but we can also get regular HTML nodes, right? But it's all node types. firstElementChild and lastElementChild ignore every node type except for the HTML elements. Okay. Usually, most of the time, we're going to be dealing with the elements. We're not really interested in the other kind of superfluous information in there, like the comments and the text, but it is valuable to actually have both of these, of course. The same is true for this idea of child nodes and children. Let's take a look at that next. So if I do document.body.childNodes, not children, notice that we have in here comment text, right? H1 text, div, and text, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? So if we look at our comment and text, so we have comment and then a text node apparently, which is kind of curious. Then we have our H1. So we can probably guess, based on what I just explained with prettier, that if we were to open up this text node, it's just a bunch of new lines in here as well, with a bunch of spacing, which is being inserted automatically for us by prettier. Now, I don't actually really like this. I don't like having the DOM being kind of cluttered up with these text nodes that are just a bunch of spaces. So arguably, like in production, we would probably try to strip these ones out so that's a bit more clear and a bit cleaner in the DOM. Okay, now the comment is definitely useful. We definitely want that in there. If you can see, if I open that up, the data in this case and the node value as well, and the text content, which we'll look at in a future video, is the comment data itself. But then we also have the div and then the H1 as well as the final text node, which is at the bottom. Now contrast this to document.body.children, right? Now we only have two elements in there, right? We only have our H1 and our div. And this makes sense, right? Notice the difference between these two, right? The first result that we get back from child nodes is a node list. It's a list of node elements, right? Or I should say nodes, I guess, not node elements. That's a confusing term. But if we do document.body.children, this is only going to give us back HTML elements. So we're going to get back an HTML collection. Okay, very similar to a node list, but only HTML elements inside of it. Okay, so it's important to notice these small differences because it actually does matter when we're building up the DOMs and also when we're querying and navigating through the DOM. Now, as you might expect, we can do document.body.children or child nodes, and we can index into it to get the first value, second value, third value, etc., as you might expect. So that works just fine as well. It is not an array, so we can't do things like map until we turn it into an actual array using things like array from. Okay. Now let's switch back here. So hopefully with that in mind, I want to show you these other ones which are very useful as well. And these are going to follow the same patterns. We have something like nextSibling and previousSibling, right? Which are dealing with, again, just nodes, regular nodes. And then their kind of siblings, I should say, are nextElementSiblings and previousElementSibling, right? And that's only element nodes without other types of nodes like we just saw. So let's take a look at that really quick. So if I do, for example, a sibling, and I'm going to show you visualization of this in a second, but if I show a sibling in this case, these two are siblings. They are kind of beside each other at the same level in the tree. Okay, they're not children of each other, and they're not a parent-child relationship. They share the same parent. Okay, so they are siblings, right? So h1 and div. So if I do document.querySelector, and I'll do the h1 tag, and I'll do nextSibling. In this case, I'm going to get a text node, which is actually, in this case, good that we're getting this, I guess. So show you that this is a node, and this is going to be the new line, right? So this is prettier. Inserting a new line text node for us, kind of annoyingly behind the scenes. But if I do the same thing, and I do nextElementSibling, you'll notice that I get what we expect, which is the actual div. All right, so that makes sense, right? Because this div is the nextElementSibling to this h1 tag. So if there is a node in here that's a text node like this, that would be kind of what Prettier is doing behind the scenes, but it's just a bunch of empty new lines. All right. Now the same is true for previousSibling, right? So if I do document.querySelector and I grab the div, I can say .previousElementSibling, and I would get the h1 tag back, right? So I can go kind of back and forward through this DOM tree structure, or I guess in this case side to side, and kind of go through all the different siblings. All right. Now, if I do document.querySelector.div.nextElementSibling, which is the last element in our DOM, you'll see that we get back null, which notes that this is the last sibling in this kind of relationship. Okay. So we can actually detect when we're at the start of kind of this list of siblings or the end of the list of siblings using check for null, for example, which is really awesome. Okay, great. Now, the last one I want to show you here before I show you a visual for all this to really put it together is this idea of a parent node and the parent element. So we saw that we can go down the DOM, right? Both with nodes and elements with firstChild, lastChild, childNodes, children, etc. We can go cross, right? Side to side and the same level using siblings. But now we need to be able to go up, right? And to go up, we can use parentNode and parentElement. As you might expect, these are referring to the parentNode and parentElement respectively. ParentNode is way less used. Most of the time we're going to be using parentElement. There are like very few edge cases where you'd actually use parentNode to actually grab something that's not an HTML element. So most of the time we're going to be using parentElement to actually grab something, because as you might expect, a text node, for example, can't really have like children inside of it. So this is mainly to do with the document and doc type and things like that. So we're going to stick with parentElement to move up the DOM tree. So if I clear out this console and I do document.body, and I can do parent element on this, right? If I do parent element, the parent element of the body is the HTML tag itself, which makes sense, right? If I do document.documentElement.parentElement, you can see that we've reached kind of the root of the tree, which is null. So there's nothing there, right? If I do document.body, firstElementChild, which is the H1 tag, right? Or I could do children at 0, parentElement, I would get back the body again, right? So we're kind of going down and then back up, right? And if I do, let me just clear this console out here. If I do in here, I want to grab this p tag and see if I can give the div tag as the parent element. I can do document.querySelector, and I can do the p tag, right, which is that one right there, .parentElement, and that's the div, right? So that's pretty awesome, right? We've seen that we can go up this tree, down the tree, and then side to side in the tree, which is actually everything that we need to actually navigate up, down, and side to side through this DOM. Really, really handy. We're going to be using this a lot alongside things like querySelector, because you can see that these are really these work really well together. Okay, now a nice visual to kind of wrap this all up is this one that I put together for us, because this all is quite a lot of new terminology. So I'd like you to maybe, this is probably a good place to pause the video, see if this makes sense to you. But let's go through this together. In this case, I just have the document body separated out, right, all by its lonesome, and I have a bunch of elements in there. So I have an H1 element, I have a div element that has a p tag in it, I have an H2 element, I have an article element, which is one of the semantic elements in HTML5, and inside of there, I have a p tag, which has a text node as well as a span node inside of it. Okay. Now, if I refer to document.body, I'm referring to this entire green section. Okay. In fact, what I probably should do is probably just put this in our example right now. So let me just do that really quick. So right after our div, I'm going to add an H2, and I'm going to say cat. Sorry for all the flipping back and forth. Cat blog, and then inside of here, I'm going to add an article, and then inside of the article, I'm going to add a was it a p tag? Yeah, and then I'm going to see Garfield says, and then I'm going to put a span, and in that span, I'm going to put a cat again. Lots of cats on this page. I hope you like cats. In fact, I'll just put this all in one line just so it's a bit easier to see. There we go. Perfect. So again, I think Prettier is going to kind of do some funky stuff in here, and it's going to add a bunch of text nodes for us. But let's just see what this actually looks like once we reload the page. So I'm going to reload this page. There is our, we shouldn't really have, I guess, our page look like this. This is not the best blog in the world, but it's a start. This is probably like the first HTML page I ever wrote, probably looked something like this. And I was very happy. This looks great to start without any styling. It's not bad. So let's actually take a look at what this looks like. So document.body. Right? That's this entire body, which has all of these elements inside of it, right? We just added these ones right here, which is the H2, and then this article, which has some things inside of it. Okay, so if we switch back here, we can see that that's all this green stuff. Document.body.children. So let's look at the difference between this. Document.body.children. That is all of the HTML nodes only, HTML element nodes only. H1, div, H2, and article, which are direct children of the body, right? Contrast this to document, and I know I'm kind of just really going through this like probably too many times, but it's so important to see the difference, right? Look at the size and difference of these, right? The children, which is just the HTML elements, is what we would probably expect to see when we're doing something like children. But when we're doing child nodes, we're grabbing everything. Look at this. We have texts, we have text comments in there, right? Probably not what you want most of the time. So be really careful to know what you're actually asking for when you're using these DOM methods. And that's the difference between them. Okay. So document.body.children is that list of elements. So you can imagine if we do document.body.firstElementChild, not the firstChild, which is the actual text node that we saw before, followed by the comment. This is the H1, right? So that's this one right here. We can do document.body.children at 0. and then we can do .nextElementSibling, right? So document.body, just to show you this, document.body.children at 0, right? That's going to be our h1. And if I do .nextElementSibling, that's going to be the one coming right after it. That's a sibling of our h1, which is our div, right? So if we look at our structure, we have our h1, and then the next sibling is the div. That's what we're getting back. So that's this one right here. If we want to kind of go further down the tree, we can do, for example, something like this. If this is document.body.children, we're grabbing the fourth element and asking for its previous element sibling. So we're actually grabbing the article and asking for its previous element sibling to grab the actual h2. So we can do this in many different ways. I'm just showing you kind of the flexibility that we get with the DOM, right? So if I do documents.body.children and I grab the fourth element in there, you can see that that's the article tag, right? That's being highlighted right there. But I can ask for, if I do next element sibling, I'll get null, right? Which makes sense because that's the last element. But if I do previous element sibling, I'm going to get the h2, right? Which is the one right before this article tag. That's an actual HTML element. LastElementChild is going to be the actual article element. So if I do document.body.lastElementChild, as you might expect, I get the article itself, which is the last one in the DOM. And then if I switch back here, I can grab, for example, the span, which is inside of this p tag, and ask for its parent element. Since this is the only span on the page, this is going to work just fine. And I'm going to get the actual p tag in that case, right? So just to show you that, I'll clear this console just so it's a bit more clear. I'll do document.querySelector just to grab that span, which is nicely nested in there inside of that p tag. You can see I get my little cat highlighted there, right? Which is the span tag, as you can see being evaluated in the console. And if I do .parentElement, right, you can see I get the entire p tag. And if I do .parentElement on that, you can see I get the article tag. And if I do .parentElement on that, I can get the body tag. And if I do .parentElement on that, I get the HTML itself, right? So that is pretty awesome. So I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up this video. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the next video is really take this to the next level, go through a bunch of exercises together to really get practice with going up and down the DOM, left and right across the DOM, just so that we can use this as a tool alongside querySelector so that we can really be comfortable moving literally anywhere inside of this DOM tree, whether it's nodes if we're interested in or elements, which is what we're interested in most of the time. I can't wait to get those exercises. I'll see you in that video. See you later.